we were sort of congratulating ourselves and very thankful, and rightfully so, that we had the best hurricane season in 31 years. And then last week, we had at least 11 tornadoes in 24 hours, literally in every corner of the state. 3 people were killed, 5 people remain hospitalized, and many more are outside of their homes, which were damaged or destroyed to the point where they are just not habitable. All that 10 days before Christmas. And so let's keep these people in our thoughts and prayers, but more than that, let's see what we can do, and certainly we're doing that as a state, working with the parish offices of emergency preparedness. But I'm asking individuals to see what you can do by donating. And each of the parishes that sustain damages have these efforts underway. And by the way, just in case you don't know each of the parishes, they're Caddo, Union, Rapides, Iberia, St. Charles, Jefferson, Orleans, and St. Bernard. So if you're able, please consider donating to a local charity or contacting one of the impacted parishes about donation drop-off sites, what continues to be in need. I want to start with some news. You may have seen it, I think, about an hour ago. We issued a press release about Capitol Lakes, which is just right outside this building. On this past Friday, I sent a letter to the EPA as the final step required to classify the long-polluted Capitol Lakes as a Superfund site. This makes it eligible for federal cleanup oversight and funding. And that typically happens with a 10% state match, 90% by the EPA. However, most often recently, and we think this will be the case, the state match requirement will likely be waived, but we'll be prepared to meet it should it not be waived. But just a little backstory on this. Pollution has been a problem at this lake since the early 1980s at least. And the PCBs were detected back then, and there were steps taken to try to encapsulate the contamination. You may know, and you can still see the signs are still posted. The Department of Wildlife and Fisheries put up signs warning against the consumption of the fish. Those signs remain up. However, back in 2017, sampling by DEQ showed that the contamination was still present at unacceptable levels, and it wasn't encapsulated. It was actually in the water. And any option to remedy this problem is obviously a huge undertaking that the state just didn't and really still doesn't have the resources for. So we've been working with the EPA on the assessment all the way through, and now we have the opportunity to breathe new life into the lakes, make them safe for wildlife and recreational use. It is going to take some time. These things don't happen immediately, but if you don't move forward, if you don't work with the EPA, if you don't get on the site, then it never would happen. And quite frankly, it's not a problem we should punt into the future. We know it's there. We need to take care of it now. And I think the end result is going to be a huge asset to our capital region. One of the things that I said quite often during my campaign for re-election, and had a hymn that was sung at my inauguration back in early 2020, was that God will order your steps. We have been taking steps in Louisiana, and that's consistent with the other part of that. God will order your steps, but you have to move your feet. We have been doing that. At the end of last week, we announced that for the 6th month in a row, we've broken our own unemployment record, with non-seasonally adjusted unemployment at 2.9%. Seasonally adjusted remained at 3.3%. That's quite impressive as it is, but I think it's even more impressive when you think where we were 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. In December of 2020, our non-seasonally adjusted unemployment rate was 6.9% and seasonally adjusted at 7.2%. So this is a massive decline in just a couple of years. Every job lost during the pandemic has been recaptured, and then some. We've added 228,000 jobs, and we have more Louisianans working today than ever before, at more than 2,042,000 employed Louisianans. Another thing I think that we should be proud of, and that seemed impossible 7 years ago when I became governor, has to do with our budget. This year, we passed a budget that makes historic investments in education at every level, unprecedented amounts of funding for our infrastructure, to include broadband, just to name a few things. Higher education, for example, received the largest state funding increase ever at almost $85 million in state general fund, another $74.3 million in statutorily dedicated funds. But pre-K, the new investment exceeded $80 million, incredibly important for us in our future. Y'all know that K through 12 teachers received a $1,500 pay raise. And after all of that, there was still more than $300 million in recurring revenue that went to one-time expenditures. Contrast that to the situation before I became governor, when every year more and more one-time dollars were spent on recurring expenditures, which we haven't done a single time since I've been governor. And as you know, the REC met last week, and in the current year recognized $925 million in excess. And we know that we closed out last year, once all the books were balanced and so forth, with a surplus that exceeds $700 million. So you add it all up. We've gone from about a $2 billion deficit when I became governor to surpluses in excess that together show about $2 billion to the good. That is a huge step forward for our state. We did that by growing and diversifying the economy and by making a lot of really strategic decisions, all of which will inure to our benefit. I can tell you that when the 25% of the surplus is put into the rainy day fund, that fund will have more than $900 million in it, which is more than had the day I became governor. And of course, 10% of that will go to the unfunded accrued liability. We have also been paying debt for the state. And every chance we get, we use the surplus, the one-time money for that, so that we don't then bond out and pay on that debt over decades. So for example, $400 million again for the second installment of that amount paid for the non-federal share of the hurricane storm damage risk reduction system that benefits parts of 5 parishes. That work, as you know, started after Hurricane Katrina. That's just one example of that. And so we're making progress. And one of the reasons this is incredibly important is because in fiscal year 26, and this is what some people lose sight of, when the 0.45 cents added sales tax goes away, and when more of the vehicle sales tax is dedicated to the State Transportation Trust Fund and doesn't flow into the State General Fund, there will be more than an $800 million hit to the State General Fund. So we need to manage expectations so that people understand what's happening in the future, which is why it's really important that we grow, diversify our economy, and that we produce this extra revenue. And of course, that'll be an issue for fiscal year 2026, as I mentioned. Also want to highlight some of the other accomplishments that state agencies have achieved. Louisiana Department of Economic Development secured $14.3 billion in new investments this year, which will create almost 8,000 new jobs in addition to all the jobs that were retained. And these projects happened in all 8 economic regions of the state. And much of this is directly attributable to our efforts to grow and diversify the economy through clean energy production and emissions reductions. And that's a great transition to tout the accomplishments, I think, of the CPRA. The reason these companies are choosing Louisiana are several, one of which we have the most productive manufacturing workforce in the United States of America, as reported by the Census Bureau, but also because of our proven commitment to clean energy future. As you all know, Louisiana became the only Gulf South state this year to have and announce a clean energy plan, a climate action plan, to reach our goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Again, the only Gulf South state with that goal. And at the same time, CPRA completed some of our biggest restoration and dredging projects in history, and the investment we're making this year, $1.3 billion in coastal restoration and protection projects through CPRA using their priorities. Now, you all know we have a 50-year plan that envisions at least $50 billion. Well, we're on track. That is the good news. And that doesn't include unprecedented amounts of federal funding coming through the Corps of Engineers for various projects like Morganza to the Gulf, New Orleans to Venice, West Shore, and so forth. We are making tremendous progress. In addition, the Department of Natural Resources applied for and was granted $25 million in federal funding for restoring orphan well sites through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And we're going to do that in a way that maximizes the reduction in fugitive emissions of methane. On top of that, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, through a CEA, contracted with the Department of Natural Resources to spend another $12.7 million to close 151 wells on federal refuges. The DOTD has been hard at work this year. Louisiana is set to receive approximately $1 billion over the course of 5 years through the Bridge Formula Program as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. There are over 500 locally owned off-system bridges in Louisiana that are eligible to receive the funding. And we have carved out $270 million for this purpose. And over the next 5 years, we will replace or repair 5 times as many off-system bridges as would have otherwise been the case because of this funding that we've allocated for this purpose. And we will work with the local parishes to determine which bridges get repaired, which are most important to them. DOTD also received word in August that our request for reallocated federal highway funding was approved. This time it was $97.8 million. The reallocation happens when funding is allocated to other states, but they're not able to obligate all of the funding within the fiscal year. That money is then available to other states, provided that we have, in fact, allocated all of our funding for the previous year, and we have. You have to have the projects for the funding, and then you have to have the non-federal match. We were able to successfully get this almost $100 million of additional funding this year, and that brings the total over the time since 2016 to right at $400 million in reallocated highway funding that we've been able to secure. And I think Dr. Sean Wilson has done a tremendous job of positioning our state to do that. Before I leave DOTD, and this really is true for a number of infrastructure projects, whether it's CPRA or DOTD, one of the great things about having surplus and excess in the current year is you all know that we're going through an inflationary period. And a lot of the projects that we are putting out for bid are coming in well over the amount that we estimated. So in order to move forward with the work that the legislature has agreed to fund, we're going to need to move some of these one-time dollars to existing projects, which if we didn't have those one-time dollars, we would be cutting back on the scope of work that we're going to do, and that won't be necessary. And I think that's a very positive thing as well. With respect to another type of infrastructure, broadband, This has been a banner year for Connect LA, which is our office for broadband development. Connect LA was awarded nearly $170 million through the Gumbo Grant Program to impact more than 80,000 locations. Now, with the private match that comes from the internet service providers, this is more than $300 million to connect those 80,000 addresses to high-speed internet that will be affordable. Additionally, Connect LA was the very first program in any state to be awarded money from the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act for broadband and digital equity planning funds. And we know that once the FCC's mapping is complete and all the states have an opportunity to weigh in on the accuracy of the mapping, Louisiana is set to receive more than $1 billion additional from the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act for broadband. That money, too, will be matched by private internet service providers, and then we feel very confident we will be able to close the digital divide in Louisiana well before our deadline of 2029. And I want to thank Vineeth Iyengar for his work and at Connect LA. I also want to commend the Department of Health, our community partners and healthcare workers for their tireless work to save lives. I'm towards the end of this set of prepared remarks and haven't talked about COVID yet. And I remember where we were at this time last year. We were going into the Omicron surge, which proved to be the steepest surge in the entire pandemic. And in January of this year, just 11 months ago, we had over 3,000 people in the hospital. So think about that. We're obviously doing much better, but that is not to say that our hospitals and other healthcare entities aren't stressed because the combination of COVID, the flu, and RSV are taxing our healthcare providers. And so I do want to encourage people to make sure you're staying up to date on your COVID vaccines and boosters. COVID is still here. It's not over. And you all know that typically in winter, when people come together indoors, there's an increase in COVID. That will likely happen again this year, but we have the tools to protect ourselves. We know who's most vulnerable to the disease as well. But we're also having one of the worst flu seasons that we've seen in a very long time here in Louisiana and around the country. There are flu shots available for that as well to maximize the protection that you have. So it's important that we all do that. I'm going to stop here and I think take a few questions and then come back and close out the press conference with a couple of more remarks. Yes, ma'am.
The insurance commissioner has asked for a special session to put funding into an incentive fund. Do you agree that that should happen, and do you believe that that's the best way to bring insurance companies back here in Louisiana?
Well, we're working with the insurance commissioner. We've had a number of conversations with him. I don't believe we will do a special session, but what we do have the opportunity to do, precisely because we have excess in the current year, when we go into session in April, we can very quickly take up a supplemental appropriation that would move money that is excess current year into the incentive program that was reestablished through legislation last year. And we will spend the time between now and April working with the commissioner and with legislators to determine what that amount of funding should be. But it will be in the neighborhood of what the commissioner is asking for. And I do think it's something that we need to do. I mean, this is a crisis that got worse this year, even though we didn't have a hurricane, and it shows the interconnectedness of the markets because there was actually 2 hurricanes in Florida, and many of the insurance companies who are in the market here in Louisiana are also in Florida. So when they get stressed there, sometimes that causes them to stop writing in Louisiana as well. It's obviously this is a crisis situation, given the tremendous increase in the book of business that is being underwritten by citizens, not supposed to be an insurer of last resort. So yeah, we're going to have to do something, and so we look forward to working with them. But I don't see a special session to do this, but I think we can take it up early in April and get the funding necessary for that incentive program. Yes, sir.
Like you said, the REC recognized about another $1.5 billion for FY23 and FY24. Do you have any ideas on how you want to use that money, keeping in mind what you said about sales?
Yeah. Yeah, so the REC recognized the additional revenue, which is, when you say $1.5 billion, so I think it's important to kind of keep those numbers in their silos. So the Commissioner of Administration will present the executive budget proposal to the legislature in February. That session where they will take up the budget will start in April. But the additional recurring revenue for next year is in the $600 million range. Obviously, there are some things that we know we need to do with that to increase funding for some state agencies such as DCFS, but we know also we want to continue to invest in education with teacher pay and so forth. And then it would be my expectation that not all $600 million of additional recurring revenue would be reflected in the budget for recurring expenditures, that like we did last year, some amount of that would be carved out for one time. I think that that's really important as we approach FY26 and make sure that we are being very responsible about how we get there so that when that $800 million hit to the state general fund comes, that it's something that we can, as a state, handle without precipitous funding cuts to essential priorities. And we're certainly well on that path based on what the REC has recognized as recently as last week. Yes, ma'am.
Earlier this year, several abortion restrictions that you signed went into effect. With the hindsight of a few months, do you think that transition is running smoothly, or do you think there's room for improvement that needs to be addressed in the next session?
Well, as you've heard me say before, I do think that there's improvement that needs to be addressed. So things have been, I would say, relatively smooth. And we've obviously had some isolated cases where individuals weren't able to access an abortion in state when they probably should have, especially given the medical futility exception that we have. Additional work has been done on that by the Department of Health to increase the specific conditions which would satisfy the exception, and leaving the general catch-all language of the medical futility exception as it is in the statute. But you've heard me say this before, and I continue to believe that we should have an exception for rape and incest as well. So that's something that I hope the legislature, and we'll ask the legislature to put in place in statute in the session that starts in April. Yes, ma'am.
With your term, the end of your term approaching, what are your top priorities in your time left to spend?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's enough work to do, and we're going to work hard every single day over the course of the next 12 and a half months or whatever it is that I have left. And really want to make sure that when we leave, that we leave it better than we found it. And the same thing that your first grade teacher taught you, or your mom and dad taught you as a little kid. And that should play out, especially as it relates to the fiscal situation in the state. When you think back to just how bad it was, the day that I became governor, there was over $800 million of one-time money in the budget for recurring expenditures. And we had already cut higher education more than any other state in the nation over the previous years. We weren't funding anything that was a priority as if it was a priority. And it took an awful lot of hard work to be able to turn that around and work with the legislature that has proven to be successful. So it's obviously critically important. But the reason I ran for governor was to increase funding for education. It really is the key to solving ills that have plagued our state for far too long in a number of areas, whether it's breaking cycles of intergenerational poverty in families and communities, whether it's improving the crime rate or the amount of people that have to be incarcerated. It's directly related to improving health outcomes and everything else. You create prosperity, you create wealth, you create opportunity through a better educated citizenry, and therefore investments in education are critically important. And we have turned the corner on that with record investments in early childhood. And by the way, I've said this before, there is nothing more important for our state long-term than investing in early childhood education so that more of our kids show up to school ready to learn. And we have to maintain these investments for at least a generation. And when we do that, we're going to see transformation at a level that we've only dreamed of. I really believe that. But we have started that. And so being able to continue that and hand that off to the next legislature, to the next governor, whoever he or she would be, is among my highest priorities. And clearly, we have unprecedented opportunities to invest in infrastructure in Louisiana, too, both because it is a priority for us, and we have the surplus money that, as you know, has to be spent on one-time expenditures like transportation infrastructure, like coastal restoration and protection, for example, and the capital outlay program to include deferred maintenance and improvements on our college campuses. So all of that's going to be critically important. And then you layer on top of that opportunities we have through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And now the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be very helpful as well. And I just think we have tremendous opportunities to invest in infrastructure too, that will make our state a better place to live and to invest and to work and all of those things. So so all of that's very important, and we certainly are going to be moving forward on all of those fronts and many more over the coming year. Yes, sir.
Governor, you still willing to meet with the legislative committee on the Ronald Reagan
Sure.
issue, and have there been any discussions on trying to make that happen?
Not to my knowledge. You know, I was scheduled to go, and the committee rescinded the invitation or whatever. I don't know if they canceled that meeting or whatever. Then there was a subsequent meeting that had been scheduled for quite a while, and a few days before it, they invited me. I had a schedule full of events, but as I told them then, I'm perfectly happy to sit down and speak with them. I can't imagine they have a question that I haven't already answered, because I've addressed every question that's been put to me, and have been asked, I think, about this at least twice about every single aspect of it as best I can tell. Yes.
Following the Ronald Reagan.
I'm coming over here next. I'm sorry. Yeah, you were in the back. I'm coming back this way. Go ahead. I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Following the Ronald Reagan case, is there anything that you regret or wish you had done differently now that charges have come out and there's a lot more information available?
No. Look, as I have said from the very beginning, that when this was obviously became public and so forth, that I believe there was criminal conduct in the manner in which the state police took Mr. Green into custody subsequent to the motor vehicle accident. I think, by and large, the indictments reflect that. And so I don't know of anything else that I would add at this point. Yes?
Governor, a lot of those projects you mentioned in the part that kind of up top involve some element of carbon capture,
Yeah.
which, as you know, has become controversial both for effectiveness and potential risk downside. Do you think those current concerns are justified? If so, how?
Yeah, no, I don't. And I think the science is sound. I think carbon capture, utilization, and storage is safe. And it's safer here in Louisiana than anywhere else because we have the geologic formations here in a high number that will permanently sequester the CO2 in a very safe way. But I do know that we have to do more, both as a state, working primarily through DNR, but primarily the private companies looking to invest in this area, to talk to people in the communities about carbon capture, and about the science, and about the safety, and how the integrity of these formations is ascertained in advance, so that they know that this is safe. Look, carbon capture is a huge part, not just of our state climate action plan, but it's very important for the country and for the world. And we are going to transition away from fossil fuels, and they will be consumed in smaller and smaller amounts as we move forward over the coming years and decades. But we can't flip a switch today and get off of fossil fuels, and therefore, if we want to achieve our carbon reductions, carbon capture is going to be an integral part of that. And quite frankly, we can't achieve our goals here in Louisiana. The country can achieve its goals without carbon capture. And this is happening elsewhere in the world too, not just here, but around the world. And so it is something that I believe in, but I know that we have more work to do in educating people, listening to them, answering their questions, and so forth. Yes, ma'am.
Recently, the Attorney General launched a tip line about child sexualization in libraries.
Yeah.
Are you concerned about child sex trafficking and obscene material in libraries, and do you think that's something the legislature should address?
All right, so just to make sure, child sex trafficking is that may not be what you were asking, but obviously we know that around the world, here in the country and in our state, we have human sex trafficking that includes children. That is a real concern of mine and of all law enforcement and all state agencies and so forth, and that's something we have to do to educate people about, to prevent as much as we can. But now, if your question is about the availability in our school libraries and other libraries of reading materials, and I don't really, is that what you're asking about?
I believe the tip line was to address both obscene materials and the possibility of child sex trafficking
Yeah.
in regards to libraries.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know what sort of tips he's getting. Anything that we can do, I think, to alert officials to human sex trafficking involving children is incredibly important. You know, I go all over the state all the time, and I speak to people. I've never had a parent tell me personally that they're concerned about what books are or are not in their libraries and so forth. Again, I don't know what sort of tips the Attorney General might be getting there. That it seems to me to be part of a national movement or a narrative that is developing out there, and I'm not sure that it's a real problem. I guess it's a perceived problem for some,
Last question.
at a minimum. Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about the legislative effort to repeal the income tax in states?
Well, first of all, I have a lot of thoughts about it. We have had a number of expert groups formed over the years to look at our tax system and to make recommendations for what it should look like, what changes need to be made. And that group was last convened back in the 2016, 2017 time period, did not recommend ending the income tax either on individuals or corporations, did recommend doing what we have done, and that is to get rid of deductions that no other state has in turn for lowering rates. And so that was a tax reform that was recommended by the group. Now, there's nothing about the income tax that I believe means that we absolutely have to keep it at all costs. The challenge I have is that many of the people talk about getting rid of the income tax. They're not talking about the funding necessary to replace it. We already have one of the lowest tax states in the nation. And so if we want to have the healthcare system that we need, if we want to invest in education, if we want to continue to make progress on a number of fronts, you've got to have the revenue. You know, people are celebrating the investments we're making, and I remind people all the time, you cannot invest what you do not have. And so if someone out there is advocating for getting rid of the income tax, okay, what's the second part of that? How are you going to replace the revenue? And a lot of times these people will point to a specific state, and maybe the state of Texas, because it is contiguous to us, and say, well, Texas doesn't have an income tax. But then you point out all the things that they do that we don't do here when it comes to getting revenue, and the people say, well, we're not interested in that. Well, I mean, we have to have a realistic, balanced approach to this. I can tell you, I don't believe that there will be a successful effort in the upcoming legislative session to eliminate the income tax. I think that maybe some people who want to explore that option in the sense of starting the conversation to see what can be agreed upon and so forth going forward. I don't believe that that's going to happen this year because I don't see the balanced approach to it. Okay, so with all of that, I want to thank you again for being here today and for your hard work over this past year covering issues that are important to the people of our state. I will have my monthly radio show on Wednesday afternoon between 2 and 3 o'clock. And then I'm hoping for a quiet couple of weeks, just like you all probably are. So that we can enjoy the holidays with our families and so forth, and then come back rejuvenated early next year. And then I'm hoping and praying that everyone will have the best, most blessed and Merry Christmas ever, Happy Hanukkah, and then 2023 for all of us and for your families will be the best year ever. And to try to get it started on the right front as you leave, I want to make sure that you help yourself to the Governor's Mansion chocolate chip cookies that have been made available to you. Thank you all, and God bless.